Islam tends to send shockwaves around the world through Islamic terrorist attacks. It is therefore entirely normal, even if it was unjust, that people connect terrorism and Islam. If every year you hear about terrorism again and again from Islam, then you start connecting those two things. This is some conspiracy theory nonsense, I'm sorry. The media is not against Muslims. Western media has been extremely careful in the last decade when it comes to Muslims and Islam. They have been extremely respectful. They do not amplify Islamic violence and Islamic terrorism and try to hide the religion when non-Muslim terrorists commit violent attacks.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. How many times have you heard a non-Muslim tell you, especially who lives in the West, why is it that all terrorists are Muslims? This video is an academic response. I'll be quoting papers which show statistics on the media coverage of Muslims, especially in the West. So let's begin. The first paper that we're going to see is titled, Why Do Some Terrorist Attacks Receive More Media Attention Than Others? The authors of the paper collected 136 terrorist incidents that happened in the United States from 2006 to 2015. And they examined how these incidents were covered in the media, especially by CNN. Now, here's the crazy part. The authors analyzed these terrorist incidents and found out that Muslims perpetrated 12.5% of these 136 incidents. And despite that, they received 50.4% of all the media coverage. Let me repeat that. Muslims perpetrated 12.5% of these terrorist attacks, yet they received 50.4% of all the media coverage. And we're not talking about media outlets that no one heard of or media outlets that are underground. No, we're talking about CNN. The paper also shows that if the perpetrator of a terrorist attack happens to be Muslim, then it is expected based on the data that this terrorist attack is going to receive 405% more media coverage.
Western media has been extremely careful in the last decade when it comes to Muslims and Islam. They have been extremely respectful. They do not amplify Islamic violence and Islamic terrorism and try to hide the religion when non-Muslim terrorists commit violent attacks.
Imagine that. As an example, there's a very interesting part in the paper that I want to read to you. When people think about terrorism, events like the Boston Marathon bombing and the Fort Hood shooting are what come to mind. This is not surprising considering that these two incidents received over 13.4% and 11.9% news coverage, respectively. Yet, so much is missed. Based on fatalities, there are a few attacks in the dataset that received less coverage than we would expect. For example, Wade Page's attack on the Sikh temple in Wisconsin killed 6 people, and it only received 2.6% of the total coverage. Fraser Miller's attack on a synagogue in Kansas killed 3 people, and it only received 2.2% of the coverage. Dylan Roof killed 9 people in an African-American church in Charleston and received 5.1% of the coverage. These attacks have 2 things in common. The perpetrator was white and the target were both religious and minority groups. These instances highlight disparity in media coverage of terrorism. Finally, this interesting chart shows percent increase in media coverage when it comes to major sources. So the major sources of the media were CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal. And as you can see, the biggest increase in media coverage happens when the perpetrator of the terrorist attack happens to be Muslim. Again, we're talking about CNN, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and USA Today. The biggest news outlets on the planet, giving Muslims almost 8 times more media coverage when they do something wrong.
Then I became a communist, a revolutionary communist, and even supported an illegal urban guerrilla organization, a terrorist organization in Turkey that was very active in blowing themselves up in the street.
Wow.
In another paper titled Media Coverage of Muslims and Refugee Policy, a study was carried out from 2015 to 2017 analyzing newscasts from major outlets like CBS, Fox, and NBC. And the analysis showed that there was not a single month where positive stories about Muslims outnumbered negative stories. Terrorist activities and conflict were the major focus of news reports about Muslims, accounting for 75% of the coverage. ISIS served as protagonist in 3/5 of all Muslim-centered stories, while positive coverage such as human interest stories or those depicting Muslims as productive members of society were overlooked. In reports where Muslims were the focus, only 3% of the voices heard were those of Muslims, while Trump spoke on their behalf 21% of the time. Stories about refugees were also negative in tone. More than half of the global refugee population is Muslim. So, as you can see from this graph here, the month where Muslims were depicted in the most positive light was on December 2016, and if you subtract the amount of positive coverage from the amount of negative coverage that Muslims received on December 2016, you'll find that they were exactly equal. And that was the month where Muslims were depicted in the most positive light. If you look at everywhere else, you will see that the amount of negative coverage Muslims received was way more. And in certain cases, like for example April 2016 and November 2016, you'll see that the amount of negative coverage doubled the amount of positive coverage. So this graph right here shows what the media was talking about when they were mentioning Muslims. So 32% of the time they were talking about terrorism and security, 43% of the time they were talking about international conflicts and war, 16% of the time they were talking about religious values and religion in general, 9% of the time they were talking about miscellaneous subjects. So who was representing Muslims in the media when they were mentioned? Only 3% of the time, Muslims were representing themselves. And keep in mind that when they bring someone and represent him as a Muslim, speaking about Muslims, the person could be an Ahmadi, the person could be a prominent deviant. It's not necessarily that he or she is a Sunni Orthodox Muslim. Now keep in mind that most Americans or Westerners in general never met Muslims. They only hear about them in the media. The same media that lets Muslims represent themselves when they were being mentioned only 3% of the time. Now, about the representation of refugees in the media, the US resettled 784,000 refugees since 2001. Of those, only 3 refugees have been arrested for terrorist activities. Of the 3 who have been arrested, 2 were planning terrorist activities, not in the United States, but in Iraq, for example. But then, when it comes to the media coverage of refugees, you'll most likely see terrorism or illegal activities being associated with them. Another very dangerous narrative as well. Here's a very sinister thing that the paper mentions. What journalists underplay are positive developments in the Muslim community and the efforts of that community to forge a place in America, which includes combating those in their community who hold extremist ideologies that do not reflect their values of faith. As an example of that, in December of 2015, Muslim activists held a public march against ISIS and terrorism. The organizers of the march summarized the news media's response to their effort in one word: silence. So these activists didn't feel that they were being heard by the media. The media was not even interested in representing them. The paper also asks very important questions. Why did television news not deem that march as worthy of its time? Why do tragic stories like 3-year-old Syrian refugee Aylan Kurdi's small body washing up on a beach in Turkey break very powerfully, but then lose resonance? Another example, why when the high-profile reporting of alleged sex assaults by Muslim refugees in Frankfurt was debunked, did the debunking get very small amount of coverage? So in the beginning, they were very eager to report about the sex assaults, but when they were debunked, they're no longer interested as much. Why does Donald Trump get 7 times more speaking time on television news when the subject is Muslims than do all Muslims' voices combined?
Western media has been extremely careful in the last decade when it comes to Muslims and Islam.
Let's go to the last paper that I'm going to talk about, addressing the myths of terrorism in America. The paper clears misconceptions about Muslims and terrorism held by many Americans because of the media that they have been exposed to. The first misconception is that international terrorism poses a far greater threat than domestic terrorism. This is a misconception because if we look at the numbers, 94.8% of terrorists were citizens of the US and 89.5% of them were born in the US. A second misconception is that jihadist-inspired attacks pose the greatest threat to the US. Again, that is false, because if we look at the numbers, we find that 49.6% of attacks were inspired by far-right ideologies. 32% of the attacks were inspired by left-wing ideologies, and 18.3% of the attacks were inspired by, quote, jihadists, unquote. Another misconception has to do with the race or ethnicity of the perpetrators of these attacks. You would see many Americans saying most of them are Arabs. However, numbers show that only 6.5% of them are Arabs and 82.2% of them were white. 8% were black and 3.3% of them were of other ethnicities. Another misconception is that terrorist violence is largely carried out by a global network of organized groups. Again, the numbers show the opposite because 69.2% of the attacks were carried out by lone wolves, and organized groups carried out only 30.8% of the attacks. Let's go through other interesting numbers. Thwarted Muslims plots attracted 7.5 times the coverage of non-Muslim plots. So what about media coverage of Muslims who were victims of terrorist attacks? So about that, American media watchdog organization Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting found that the 2017 Quebec mosque shooting received 6 times less coverage in American media than the 2014 Parliament Hill attack, which was carried out by a Muslim, even though the mosque shooting involves more deaths, but it receives 6 times less coverage in media. Now, this is outrageous because there is a golden rule in news coverage, which is if it bleeds, it leads. However, this formula is inverted when the people bleeding are Muslims. Here's another outlandish example. A survey of the Canadian national newspaper The Globe identified 66 articles on one incident, and the incident was the Shafia femicide, where a Muslim of Afghan origin killed some of the female members of his family. However, when it comes to the murder of women and domestic violence, from 2005 to 2012, only 59 articles were written about the general topic of murder of women and domestic violence, versus 66 articles covering one case perpetrated by one Afghani Muslim, widely represented as honor killing. What does that tell you about the motive of Western media? Because if the motive behind these articles were the well-being of women and speaking out against violence against women, then why do they suddenly become way more interested when a Muslim man does something bad to women? Why aren't both types of cases represented equally?
Western media has been extremely careful in the last decade when it comes to Muslims and Islam. They have been extremely respectful. They do not amplify Islamic violence and Islamic terrorism and try to hide the religion when non-Muslim terrorists commit violent attacks.
In a 2011 paper, it is stated that analysis of coverage of terrorism events in mainstream national American print and digital news media found that terrorism is framed primarily as a problem from Islam, with domestic terrorism being treated as less threatening. And we've seen that numbers show the opposite of that. That actually, domestic terrorism is more threatening than international terrorism, and it's even more frequent. In the same paper, it is mentioned Muslim perpetrators of violence were more likely to be identified and defined as terrorists, and they're more likely to be labeled using their religious identity, represented as having more violent motives, and linked in media reports to larger terror networks, even before motive had been authoritatively established. So they're mind readers now. This shows that the media is so eager to make the attack seem bigger than it is, because studies have shown that if the attack was carried out by a larger terror network, the consumers of the media become more afraid. And now the news report becomes more scary. And now people become so attached to their TV screens, looking for more information and so on. It's a vicious cycle. Now, let's continue. The threat represented by non-Muslim perpetrators, in contrast, was individualized, i.e. not linked to some larger terror network. In addition to that, the non-Muslim terrorist is more likely to be labeled as a mentally unstable individual. And about Muslim men specifically, a 2007 paper mentions that in the media, Muslim men were primarily covered in relation to topics such as terrorism, militancy, and illegal immigration, establishing them as fanatics who needed to be controlled.
According to several studies, Muslims are the biggest religious group against military targeting of civilians. For example, in this Gallup poll, a question was asked to several religious groups, including atheists as well. Some people think that for the military to target and kill civilians is sometimes justified, while others think that kind of violence is never justified. What is your opinion? Muslims voted 78% to never, which means 78% of Muslims voted that it is never justified for the military to kill and target civilians, while 21% of them voted sometimes. And according to the numbers that you see, no group was more opposed to targeting civilians than Muslims. But you won't see that being reported much on the news. According to another study, you got got Egypt, Qatar, Tunisia, Iraq, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Pakistan, Indonesia, Libya, Iran, Jordan, and so on. All of these Muslim countries were more opposed to military attacks on civilians than many Western countries like Sweden, France, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Israel, and the United States. But again, you won't see that being reported much on the news.
Here's another study from 2016 saying Muslims most likely faith group to reject military attacks on civilians. So now we see the same conclusion being repeated again and again and again through several studies. And with that, I think I'm done. What I've mentioned is more than enough in my opinion. And I've mentioned all my sources. You can check them yourselves. So now you know how to respond academically to an Islamophobe.
Islam tends to send shockwaves around the world through Islamic terrorist attacks. It is therefore entirely normal, even if it was unjust, that people connect terrorism and Islam. If every year you hear about terrorism again and again from Islam, then you start connecting those two things.
Because you're so gullible that you believe everything that you hear on TV. That's why. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.